Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Well Said, where I interview policy experts, commentators, academics, students, activists on various topics of higher education, free speech, and other related topics on American culture and policy. You can share this episode on Facebook or YouTube, as well as any podcast platform such as Apple, Spotify, or Anchor. Download the episode and listen anytime. If you like what you heard today, give our podcast a 5-star rating and go to our website, speechfirst.org, and press donate. Okay, I'm excited to welcome Ben Weingarten, the deputy editor of Real Clear Investigations, to our show today. Ben also contributes to The Federalist, The New York Post, The Epoch Times, and other publications. You can subscribe to his newsletter at weingarten.substack.com and follow him on Twitter at BHWeingarten. Thank you for joining, Ben.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. So you wrote a fantastic article on those who are silenced, shunned, and canceled on college campuses today. And I think this is a really good way to put it, because you actually were able to interview some professors or experience those who were not willing to talk to you about what's going on in campuses, but more specifically, what's going on with DEI and ESG. So before we delve into your experiences with interviewing and investigating this issue, I would like you to kind of just start us off with giving a definition of, or like just kind of your definition of ESG, DEI, and how this is being taught on campuses, and what more specifically you saw at UPenn.
Well, I think your audience is probably familiar with the fact that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion has been really embedded in and embraced by virtually every single influential institution in our country at this point. As Chris Rufo has reported, I think of the top 100 largest companies, all of them show that in one way or another, they have policies aimed at diversity, equity, and inclusion. This manifests itself in a whole slew of ways internally within both academic institutions as well as financial institutions, be it on a corporate side, the makeup of a company itself, training in quote unquote anti-racist principles and embracing of all manner of policies that are putatively aimed at creating more representation of peoples in proportion to characteristics they often have no control over, including their race, and using that lens, to use their terminology, when it comes to crafting all of their policies, many of them which might not be directly related when we're talking about a corporation necessarily to their bottom line, but they believe to be virtuous, just, and good. And that also manifests itself also for corporations in progressive political activism generally. Now, ESG is another sort of movement that's been embraced in the corporate world. And we've seen a transition from what was perceived to be shareholder capitalism, which is businesses exist to drive profits, maximize profits for their shareholders, to stakeholder capitalism, which says that businesses have to maximize profit or benefit for a whole slew of parties, not just customers, but vendors, suppliers, lenders, and really more broadly, the world itself, all of society as a stakeholder. And so this has manifested itself when we talk about ESG in terms of these three principles of environmental, social, and governance factors. The environmental one is well understood to generally manifest itself in a push for net zero policies, sustainable supply chains, and the like. So environmentalism as applied to business. Beyond that, of course, there's the social side, and that really can manifest itself in sort of the embrace of the DEI principles and more broadly, kind of a social justice oriented focus, again, internally in a company's policies and practices, as well as the political views that it espouses and the causes it takes on, oftentimes through its coffers. And then the governance side is more about the fact that there's actually accountability within a company, strict and rigorous controls in place, at least on its face, but it can also manifest itself in oftentimes these shareholder resolutions that corporations have increasingly embraced to ensure that companies report on diversity within their workforces and within their boards of directors, and then that their boards of directors actually follow some sort of representation proportional again to where people fall in society. So oftentimes it's kind of the application of DEI principles within a company. And so the focus of my article, long-winded way of getting there, was on the embrace of ESG for business and DEI, both as majors and beyond. At the Wharton School, obviously one of the most renowned and prominent business schools in American history, and what the significance of that was, and then how it manifests itself and what people on campus actually think about it, because both ESG and DEI on their face would seem to not only be kind of separate and apart from what you'd be learning in a business school, either entrepreneurial skills or basic finance, accounting, and the like, but in reality, as some argued, as critics have argued with ESG and DEI, that the embrace of those principles at companies actually ultimately serve to the detriment of their operations, their shareholders, and beyond. And so that was the focus of that article, and led me to this other one at Newsweek about the shunned, silenced, and canceled at universities who actually are critical of the embrace of these kinds of disciplines.
Great. Okay. So then I guess when you're looking at the Wharton School of Business specifically, are you saying that there is now actual degrees that students can get while studying business in ESG or DEI on that campus?
That's correct. This academic year will be the first year where those are actual majors. There's a major in ESG, ESG for business, and DEI as well. And then at the undergraduate level within Wharton, all undergraduates receive the same degree, but you can concentrate in specific areas. And so undergraduates as well will be able to concentrate in ESG for business or DEI.
This is fascinating to me because it actually reminds me a lot of the shift in the academy generally, where the role of the administrator is now kind of a career path, or, you see like these HR career paths, and they kind of end up falling into these bureaucratic jobs at universities, when it used to be the academy was run by those who were thought leaders in the academy, right? Like you had professors and other academics who would run universities and teach on occasion, or maybe not teach at all and just run the university separately. But there seems to be this shift where we're going to continue seeing folks who are even in other disciplines like business, where folks are actually being encouraged, or students are being encouraged to, instead of focusing on the skill that's actually going to benefit them in the long run with their job, whether it be like finance or marketing or whatever path they're going down in the business route, they're actually instead going to kind of pile on this administrative role, right? Of like, because I mean, what reason would there be to get a degree in ESG if you're not going to be the ESG administrator at some company, right? So like, how does the university advertise this type of stuff? How do they talk to the students about it?
Yeah, so I will say, first of all, I think your point is really well taken, that we always hear this cliche, but it certainly has borne itself out, that we're all living on the campus now. And there's been a dramatic increase on campuses in terms of administrative staff, huge overhead associated with administration. And that manifests itself in sort of the equivalent of like an HR bureaucracy on campuses. And we've seen, of course, at the same time, the explosion of administrators on campuses who are very much focused on these very kinds of areas of ESG and DEI and the like. You've seen an explosion of the administrative state, and you've seen the explosion of, or at least a desire for, associated staffers, like you said, at companies. So how do proponents at a business school like Wharton kind of justify this increased emphasis on ESG or DEI? Well, they'd say a couple things. The first thing they'd say is, look, corporations are embracing these principles, and so they need people with the expertise of a Wharton grad to go and fill burgeoning roles in creating essentially these mini administrative states within companies. The companies will also claim that if you adhere to these principles, it actually leads to better business outcomes. And there is huge dispute and debate over this. And the last year has really challenged the proponents of ESG in the financial services world, for example, which exerts substantial influence over what the companies that it invests in and advises actually do. Obviously, you wouldn't want to be disfavored by major investors, and you're going to cater to their interests and their whims. And so the financial services industry, in a large part, has been all in on embracing these principles, but ESG-related companies have performed quite poorly in the last year, where there's been a massive rush, for example, into the oil companies and the like, the kinds of companies, the very companies that would be disfavored if you're a proponent of ESG. So there's conflicting evidence, to say the least, on how profitable putting what they perceive to be, or would argue to be, the good above just profits. And it's not clear that it aligns with profits. But the schools will also say, in addition to catering to their students, they're also catering to some of their faculty who believe that you need to, and they kind of describe it in clinical terms, embrace all of these other factors in your analysis of a business and in your operations for it to do well. You know, the critics of ESG in business will say, but look, businesses, of course, internalize myriad factors to determine how best to align themselves, to operate, to ultimately pursue profit and their other interests. So it's not as if businesses didn't incorporate their environmental impact or beyond in the past. But needless to say, they'll say that it's not just corporations who demand graduates in these disciplines, but they'll also say that, look, faculty want this to be a focus, and then their students, of course, as well, who, as you well know and your audience well knows, and as some who I interviewed in connection with this piece argued, have been essentially indoctrinated in an ESG/DEI kind of push and environment and a broader progressive environment for years, coming well before they went to a top undergraduate school and then ended up matriculating to a place like Wharton. So they get it from all sides. The school itself, Wharton, I cite in the piece a recent fundraising appeal that their president put out, and their new president is very intently focused on pushing ESG and DEI, where she basically says, we want to be the leaders in ESG, and that's kind of why you should contribute to us. So if the school is putting that out in an appeal, I think that also says that donors are likely positively attuned towards that message as well. So as with corporations who get a push towards ESG, DEI, and being more socially conscious, quote unquote, from below, from their employees, and then sometimes from their boards, and then from other executives as well, and then from the marketplace,
right?
You see a similar dynamic playing out at universities as well.
Yeah, so you touched on a lot of things there, and I want to kind of dive deeper into each of those issues with the role of kind of where the money is coming from, donors and trustee board members, but then also the students' influence and impact on all of this. But first, I want to kind of ask you a bigger picture question. Like ESG, I mean, we've talked about DEI and some of the on this podcast and some of the bigger effects this is going to have on society at large, as well as, you know, thinking about censorship and coercion and that mentality that's coming out of the academy. What do you see are some of the bigger effects of promulgating this concept of ESG, taking it to the level that it's attempting to be taken to? Because as you said, companies have, you know, for a long time now, before ESG really popped up, before the DEI stuff got really bad, we're always kind of trying to be conscientious of the environment and their impact on the environment. It wasn't until ESG that it actually started to really take hold in the boards of these companies and be enforced in a way that was basically silencing anyone who would even attempt to question some of these theories. So I'm asking, so what do you see as some of the bigger picture long-term issues that we're going to face if our companies are focusing so heavily on ESG?
Well, to the extent you see ESG as anti-capitalist in nature, and as you describe it, you know, sort of a totalitarian, because it's about you have to follow our beliefs in a whole slew of areas, and if you don't, you're going to face punishment. You know, at a very high level, you have the fruits of capitalism in these corporations that are usually profitable in a whole slew of sectors that may well undermine capitalism with those very fruits to the extent they support policies that undermine it. It obviously creates a chilled workplace, and that's going to trickle down into various other sectors of society as well, because many people spend most of their waking hours at their places of work. And you can imagine how demoralizing it would be if you have a different view and your company is pushing an entirely opposite view. And you know, you might have felt that, look, whatever a company believes, that should stay, you know, kind of in the personal lives of the individuals who constitute it. But now you have essentially a party line that exists, or is starting to exist, not just in your school or in your media, but in your place of work. And I think the fear of many who see ESG as taking over the financial world is that ultimately companies can use their market power to have undue influence outside the political process. And this is well seen, the opposite side of this, for example, in a governor like Ron DeSantis taking on Disney, or you have many Republican state attorneys general now who are essentially pulling their state public funds out of institutions that they would argue hate what they stand for or what their constituents believe in, like a BlackRock, for example, the world's largest asset manager. So you can see corporations using their power in a whole slew of ways to influence society, outside of just what they advocate for or funding, obviously, progressive activist sorts of causes. And it creates a world where everything is political and there's no separation. Right. And you essentially have what could be argued is a state ideology that's being imposed outside the political system, outside the political process. And, you see this very clearly when you have these ideas being embraced at universities, which of course are supposed to be homes for rigorous debate, freedom of thought, and academic inquiry. And if you have worldviews that do not allow competing views that argue, in effect, as I kind of argue right in this piece, is almost directly stated that the science is settled on a thing like climate, or at medical schools where you literally can't pursue whole areas of inquiry. Obviously, this is going to have manifest effects on not just our pocketbooks, but on our health, on our well-being, and our ability to function as a cohesive society. So certainly the implications of this go way beyond just what happens in a quote unquote woke capitalist institution.
Yeah, no, I think that you did a great job kind of summarizing the various aspects of life that are going to be touched by this. I guess so. So there's two groups that we've kind of mentioned so far: the groups of folks who are very much for this, and then obviously the ones who are very much against it, or kind of, they're kind of against it, but they won't say that out loud. So I want to talk about the group of people who are very much for this. So you mentioned, faculty and students who are defending these concepts and these types of degrees and these pushes, in addition to kind of the administrative bodies at the university. So I want to kind of dive into that a little bit more. So we talked about how students are coming up all the way through K through 12. And by the time they get to university, like they're pretty much already in this mindset that these are the priorities of their life. And, anything else beyond that is kind of just a side effect. So can you talk more about how students are coming in already pre-indoctrinated to these business schools? Because we've talked about this on the podcast before with regards to law schools, how students are coming in to law schools without any real understanding of the Constitution, because it's just not really taught anymore, of the founding or the founding principles of the law and the legal system in this country, and seeing how that translates through a law school education. So I'm curious that same effect that's having and how that translates through like a business school education.
Yeah, so, I would say as a general matter, and this isn't based on any research or investigative work that I did in connection with this piece, but as you and your audience well know, public and private schools for that matter, because we've seen all manner of reports on the most elite private schools fully embracing the same sort of progressive ideological regime. The progressive view is pervasive across schools in this country. And it's natural that this would be the case when you consider that progressive dogma dominates in most governments. Governments themselves don't usually want to shrink and don't believe in limiting themselves. And so, of course, public schools in particular are, generally speaking, going to take on the character of their state, I would argue, of the state that governs them. So consequently, and then when you add on the fact, of course, that if you look at the teaching universities, those are heavily ideological. If we want to go back in history to John Dewey and others, there was an intense focus by early progressive and progressive educators on dominating in the institutions, because you can have massive influence, obviously, if you help inculcate the minds of Americans and mold those minds. The teachers' unions themselves are, of course, ideologically left dominant. So add in all those factors on top of whatever bent academia might generally have and have had historically. And you get schools that generally are going to churn out what I would argue are social justice activists. And that's, from a very young age, on top of, even if the teachers might not necessarily be so aligned, the textbooks and the curricula themselves that are mandated oftentimes are going to lend themselves to this kind of worldview. That's before we even get to, what you learn at home, what you learn on social media and beyond. So you have all these different influences, I think, and that has to play a huge role on the American mind broadly. And, in interviewing people in connection with this Wharton story, as one person on the con side of this kind of argued, look, even if you didn't get it in college, you got it well before college. You go to college, you're in an environment that's obviously dominated, most universities by those on the left who contribute heavily to Democrat candidates. And we've seen all manner of data on that and the like. And empirical evidence of, the chill over competing views on campuses. When it comes to business schools, one of the fascinating things that I found was that as one subject told me, this is sort of baked right into the applications to business schools. They'll ask questions like, how do you want to change the world with your business degree? And the kind of comments, not verbatim, but that was made to me, but was, you never get a question on a business school application. What do you want to do to protect the status quo? And what do you want to do to further capitalism and kind of the American way of life? So it's kind of baked into the process from the start. That's before you get to, affirmative action or soft affirmative action within institutions, which, is separate and apart from merit. And, just to add one more point on that, one of the things that was interesting in investigating this story was you also have the financial services institutions, big investment banks, for example, who come to a place like Wharton to recruit, and they'll have fellowships or essentially scholarship programs that are diversity oriented, that is rooted in, race or ethnicity and the like. And in addition, in their recruiting, they'll have these breakout sessions broken by affinity group. So they'll have a breakout session for LGBTQ students who want to work at XYZ leading investment bank, Latino students, Black students, et cetera. And as this subject told me, basically everything but whites, Asians, and whiter Asian males as their own kind of breakout groups. So they, and he said that you could see in the recruitment process that there was a direct, kind of line between these affinity groups and then who actually, and these breakout sessions, giving these people legs up in the recruiting process and getting very heavily sought after, summer analyst or associate positions. So that's all a way of saying it's kind of baked into the process, and this is how it manifests itself on the business school side of things.
Yeah. So you're talking about two different ways that it's baked in. One is that they're already indoctrinated by the time they get to the university. And I remember hearing stories, especially on the ESG front, because so much of that is influenced by like these kind of climate activists who think that the world is always going to end because of capitalism, even though they partake in capitalism probably just as much, if not more than others, with their private jets and whatnot. But so I remember hearing stories of students, young students in elementary school having serious amounts of anxiety because they believe that the world is going to end very soon and that they're all going to die and there's nothing that they can do to stop it. And these are the types of stressors that that teachers at that age are putting on students. So they're already in this mental, like really sensitive kind of mental state by the time they start to learn more and more and become teenagers, that they think that the world needs to be changed. Like they are convinced that they have to do something to save the world by the time they get to high school. And when they get to high school, as you said, when they start looking at college applications, I remember too, applying for college, it was always kind of like, how are you going to not really change the world, but like, what is some major thing that you're going to do to affect change, right? It was never just kind of talk about why you're interested in this issue. It wasn't like your traditional questions that you would imagine. It was always kind of like, you're going to change the world because that's the mentality everyone wants to put you in. And I remember also looking at, just recently, we were looking at, I think it was Yale Law School applications. And I think a lot of the law schools have this, and I imagine just the same with business schools and whatnot, where you have to, there's this kind of like soft DEI, soft affirmative action, as you put it so nicely, as you don't just write, you're not required to write an essay on how you're diverse or how you have a diverse, unique background, but it's certainly an option. And they do lay it out. optional essay, talk about how your unique and diverse background has contributed to your path today. And students feel obligated to answer that question, especially white or Asian students who are like, if I don't answer this question, I'm definitely not going to, if I don't fill out another essay, there's going to be all these people who do write these essays, and I'm going to be left out of that mix. So somehow you end up getting students talking about then all of a sudden their various friends who are minorities, and they talk about how that person has influenced them. And it's just like, you're putting them in this mentality that's putting a lot of pressure on them to fit that mold that, like you said, now the recruiting firms are looking for. So it is interesting how it is baked in at every level and every administrative level, again, because we can talk more about that. But let's go into the tops, because you mentioned a couple folks that you've talked to. I do want to touch on first of all, who was willing to talk to you and willing to put their name out there? Were they students, faculty, administrators? And then who was not, and why? Because sometimes you often hear about this fear, right? And there's always, every time I talk about students' fears to speak up and their chilled speech on campus and how there's a lot of self-censorship, the people who are very suspicious of those comments usually will react and say, oh, well, they're just afraid. They're just, they're not, there's no real consequences that they're actually fearing. There's no tangible consequences. They just need to grow a pair and essentially like speak up and speak out more. But I think there are some real tangible consequences here. And I would like to hear about some of those that you've also discovered through your research.
Yeah, so I reached out to students, recent alums, faculty, and then some in the administration at Wharton as well. And then some other professors, one of whom actually got his start and I think earned tenure initially at Wharton as well. And he did speak on the record and gave some interesting comments. But, generally speaking, I kind of had to daisy chain from one student to the next to find someone who would talk. I didn't have any active students who were willing to go on the record, perhaps understandably, because it would be a lot of pressure, certainly, and could potentially lead to a huge stigma, if not a backlash on a campus, if you're going to take the position publicly under your own name that is opposite that of the administration and presumably lots of the faculty as well. So, the alums, some of them were willing to speak on record, some of them not under their name, but allowed me to quote. And, they didn't necessarily spell out precisely why they were uncomfortable speaking, but it's very easy to imagine on any of a number of levels what they had to lose potentially by speaking. Some of them are, first of all, within whatever firm you're working at in a, potentially prestigious or high paying or otherwise great job, if you're going to come out and take a position on what's considered a sensitive issue, that could obviously lead to repercussions within your company or create tension with your employee and your fellow employees. Now, of course, you almost never would hear this from the opposite side of, I'm really pro DEI and progressive, and I'm afraid to speak out because I'm going to alienate my colleagues. I don't really think I've heard too many stories of that. I'm sure it exists, but obviously there's substantial pressure on the other side. Beyond that, if you ever want to send your kids to one of these schools, potentially, do you want to come out on record as taking a position that's against the school and its administrators publicly? So you can imagine just right off the bat, a couple of the downsides for the alums, but to their credit, many of them did speak. With respect to current faculty, those who did not have tenure essentially told me, really appreciate your reporting on this, but I'm not comfortable speaking. And obviously it's because they fear that they might imperil their tenure. So that's obviously a huge incentive not to talk, not to take a position that's antithetical to that of the institution they're serving. Others who do have tenure were not willing to put their names in print, but were willing to speak. And I think felt compelled to speak and probably would argue that it's really not about me, whatever voice you're putting to it, but here's my ideas. And I think it's important to get these out, which are kind of, that there is this chilled environment on campus. There might be a bigger silent minority than we even think, but they're cowed and they're afraid to speak out when there is sort of a party line that prevails on campuses. And so generally speaking, people want to put their heads down and not be seen. And the thing that was a recurring theme was look, there are people that take a different position on this. And when they're one-on-one with other students or with faculty, they may open up and speak freely. But in the broader environment on campus, it is chilling. And as a consequence of that chill, it's very hard for that silent minority to communicate because people don't know who's in that silent minority. Right. It's kind of it's an interesting, sort of in a perverse way, dynamic of there may be those out there who take a different position, but they don't even know that there are other ones out there, right, because there is this chilled climate. Now, that said, many of the alums who did take, kind of an anti-ESG or certainly anti-DEI position said that professors in their classes strained to kind of, if they're going to talk about climate and how businesses think about climate and the like, they might also present the opposing position. That was heartening to know that kind of both sides were being portrayed in classes as they are now. But one wonders if in a decade it'll be the same based upon the environment that we see. But I think more broadly, it's sort of based upon where each of these kinds of cohorts of interview subjects were in life, they saw potential downsides to their careers, to their families, ultimately to their livelihoods, to speaking out and taking a position that's antithetical to the establishment position. And it just struck me that on ESG, it's interesting that that's the case because, with DEI, I think you could make the very simple 30,000-foot argument. Well, if you're against anti-racism, then you're a racist, even though those who would oppose anti-racism would say, well, actually, anti-racism as it's presented looks racist to me. But if you're going to take the anti-DEI position, the implication is, well, then you are against different peoples. You are against treating people equitably and being inclusive and the like. It strikes me that it's interesting that now there's a similar chill that seems to be developing around ESG, and we've seen this even in prominent executives within financial services companies. In some cases, have basically called BS on ESG internally, and they've paid a serious price for it. So, understandable that people are scared and playing this close to the vest, and this is just one of myriad issues that seem to be third rails on campuses.
Right. Yeah. And I think you mentioned the tenure aspect. Obviously, if a professor does not have tenure, that's something they're super worried about. So it's going to be very much on the forefront of their mind. But even now we're seeing evidence that you're not necessarily safe if you have tenure, right? So we saw Professor Katz at Princeton and Amy Wax as well, they were both let go for making comments about the anti-racist movements and how like the actual negative effects that affirmative action or the Black Lives Matter movement might have on campus and on minorities even in their education. And they were both fired and they both had tenure. So this is what's kind of fascinating is that, there are other professors I've seen too, where it's like they almost get fired or they have to fight very hard legal battles in order to stay on campus, but they have tenure. And it's because the universities these days are just realizing that we can't allow even any dissenters to exist. And especially those who think that they're insulated from, making an example out of these guys, I guess, kind of like we can't allow people to think that they're insulated from any kind of consequence of being a dissenter. So that is really disconcerting on the front of the kind of the professors and those who are in the academy. And it ends up dissuading a lot of conservatives who are getting PhDs from even going into academics. They end up finding other jobs at like various think tanks or, I don't know, what do you do with it when you have PhDs and you don't teach? I guess you find something to do, probably doesn't pay very well. And you don't get that kind of that institutional support that would be really helpful for you to make a difference or to do real research. If you were at a university. So that's really unfortunate. And that's kind of what's happening here. But I would say even on the students' side, right? So when the students are thinking about the real tangible consequences, we've seen evidence of professors refusing to give students letters of recommendation for various scholarships or study abroad opportunities simply because they wanted to study abroad in Israel, for example, or wanted to, it was known that the student was participating in a Turning Point event or was part of College Republicans. So professors are not, faculty generally they're not dissuaded in any way from being prejudiced against conservatives on campus either. They're very upfront about it in a lot of ways, and students are aware of this, that there can be real consequences. But in your article, you also talk about career prospects. students, alumni, and the alumni children and professors' children who want to go into whether it be business or other prominent career paths would be concerned of their kids being associated with them if they spoke out. What that would look like for their career prospects. So who was it that kind of had these bigger concerns? And I'm curious what was really said about that from the alumni that you interviewed.
Yeah, so this was my experience, which just happened to coincide with as I was working on this story. I was at a intimate dinner among the canceled, so to speak, among a handful of professors and others in the academy, associated with the academy, who had faced blowback for taking politically unpopular positions. And basically in dealing with them one-on-one, you could sense in some cases they explicitly made clear that, look, there are ramifications for their families here beyond just their livelihood, their paychecks, them being able to pursue what they want to pursue in the world, that their kids could face a stigma. They might hear things from their friends or their peers, obviously hurtful, casting aspersions on their parents. And then obviously, if your parents out in the world taking a position that, they feared that their kids could face consequences seeking out jobs or pursuing their ambitions out in the world as well. And it just strikes me that, that's a significant transition in American life. People didn't bear the sins of their parents before.
Yeah.
And obviously, you take this to its most extreme level in a place like in North Korea, where you have a family that runs afoul of the regime, and then for multiple generations, that family is punished. And you can foresee us directionally following a similar kind of trajectory of, as we know, for example, let's be concrete. In the Trump administration, after the Trump administration concluded, there was effectively a blacklist put out of, you should not hire these people who worked in the Trump administration. And there was some blowback over that blacklist, and that effort, that initiative kind of died down. But you've seen any number of articles pointing out that, major firms will not hire, whole cohorts of people because they served an administration that was viewed as unjust, evil, inhumane, deplorable. And you could see something analogous happening in the schools as well. If you're one of those rare few professors who dares to challenge orthodoxy on campus, what is going to be the effect on your kids? Well, potentially it could be a negative effect down the road. That seems to be the direction that we're going. It's not necessarily that there are concrete examples right now of, this person's child can prove they didn't get an internship or a job as a consequence of what their mom or dad taught in a class or wrote in an article or a scholarly paper, but you could certainly foresee it in the kind of climate that we're operating in today, where there are whole areas of thought or views that are just completely verboten in polite society, and that kids could bear the brunt of the onslaught against based upon what their parents were arguing. So that was a concern that was expressed essentially explicitly in this kind of dinner that I sat in among the canceled. And it is interesting that for the left in particular, who talk about embracing people who dare to challenge convention and the like, there are people challenging convention out there today, and they're the most maligned, and not just in the academy, but outside the academy as well.
Right. That is a really, really interesting point to bring up with this new concept, this new fear of children having to bear the sins of their parents or family members generally. I mean, this is straight out of the book of communist China. This is something that this is not a concept that has never been heard before. This was and currently is being practiced in regimes that we usually look down on and that are supposed to be very opposite of what we have here. And you're thinking about like students and family members who are here in the United States from China are constantly worried about the treatment of their family members back home based on whatever political statement or position that they take while they're not in China. And this is a huge concept that we could have an entire different podcast just on this topic alone. But I think it's really interesting that you bring that up, and that is an explicit concern of these professors and folks in the academy who've been canceled. And I think that honestly, like, we should have another conversation about that, because that is huge when it comes to the mentality of, thinking even back to like East Germany, where the Stasi is asking parents to report on, or kids to report on their parents, and neighbors to report on neighbors. This is something that has been used before, and is straight out of those playbooks. Okay, so in saying all of that, I do want to shift gears here a little bit, and talk about so you talked about some of this, like this dinner that you were at, where you had a bunch of canceled professors, but there are also some conferences that have been happening, and we've seen kind of this weird, strange new trend of, these kind of academic conferences. And Stanford University, I think, was the most recent one. They hosted a conference where they brought a bunch of kind of pro-free speech, supposedly pro-free speech academics, to their campus, to just essentially talk about, like, how do we promote free speech on campus? How do we make sure viewpoints are represented? And I thought that was super interesting, because I've seen things like this before. I was a little shocked to see it happening at Stanford's campus, just knowing some of the folks who work there. But it was, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, because my imagination is that it's just a bunch of either conservative professors who are commiserating, but not going on the record saying a bunch of stuff, or is there actual progress, you think, being had at these conventions and these conferences? I'm a little bit more skeptical that there is any progress coming out of this. I think it's more of just kind of like, let's all like pat each other on the back and, and just, like go back to our jobs at these miserable places. But do you think that this is a sign that, the public and even the academy is starting to reject some of the stuff that's going on?
Well, I think, look, the fact that those professors who have been maligned are having a conference and it's publicized and there's an agenda out there and the like, if you're going to take the optimistic view of it, but not a Pollyannish view, I think you would say that, look, they're out and open about the fact that there's something wrong within college campuses, and they're going to at least be public in terms of espousing the view that this is wrong, and we're not going to be totally silenced. We're going to actually have, a conference that people can attend, and we're going to talk about the issues on campus. Now, on the other hand, the fact that you're only talking a few dozen professors, and that we can point to, the couple conferences like this that exist out there, that would point me more in the pessimistic side of things. The fact that you need such a conference in the first place, I think, is a remarkable development in the history of the West and the academy. And one of the things that strikes me more broadly, and why I feel that it's so perverse that there is this chilled feeling, environment, climate on campuses, is the campus is supposed to be the seed of academic inquiry. If you don't have freedom to think, you can't have any academic inquiry. You can't make progress. You can't look at problems in new ways, challenge convention, and ultimately make for a more prosperous intellectual life that trickles down, hopefully, to a better society. The schools have essentially repudiated the very principles on which they're based, on which they stand, that they're supposed to foster and further. I went to Columbia University, and etched atop the main buildings, including the library, are these names who are the key individuals in the development of the Western canon. And there's a core curriculum that's part of Columbia. And that is what our civilization is based in. And I just see a total repudiation, particularly among elite schools, of those very principles, and undermining exactly what they stood on and what allowed them to develop into the institutions, the storied institutions that they are today. And of course, the intellectual sphere does influence every other aspect of our society. And so that's how you get the views of the campus. They're always, maybe less than a generation ahead of what happens ultimately in society, but there's a clear line that you can draw between what happens on the campus and, again, what happens in the society. So it's demoralizing, I think, to say the least, that there is this chilled environment. Eric Kaufman has done some really exceptional scholarly work on showing the chill that exists, among both students and faculty. But I take these conferences, the optimistic side is it's good that we're having these conferences, even if it is just more a commiseration session than okay,
Right.
here are the size, scope, and nature of the problems, and here's a way that we can push back against them. But by the same token, that you have to have these conferences alone, I think it represents or illustrates that there's been a significant loss of something in the intellectual sphere, and the associated problems are manifesting themselves in every aspect of American life now.
Yeah, I guess my cynicism mostly comes from, I imagine that they absolutely recognize there's some loss in the intellectual sphere, but I think I am more hesitant to believe that they actually at these conferences come up with real solutions to the problem, right? More kind of like talking about the problem itself. How it's even in policy conferences, it's rare to come up with real solutions. So I'm always skeptical of all of that. But I am excited. You're right. We should be excited about the fact that it is being recognized, if not by, only by a small percentage of the academy, that it is actually becoming more publicly recognized. And that's my next question to you is, do you think, do you think the American people and just like society, do you think everyone's getting a bit fed up with this wrong think, anti-dissenters, anyone who's going to push back, that mentality that we're seeing? Is there kind of everyone's fed up with it now and we're all just going to start calling it out when we see it? Or do you still think there's a large swath of Americans who are willing to kind of go along with this stuff, thinking that, oh, I'll give this little, bit of freedom here and this little bit of freedom here and this little bit of concern for my safety if I speak up here. I'll just let that all go. I'll use the pronouns. I'll use all this, I'll just do whatever they want just to keep them off my back. Because I'm always tempted to say that it's more of the complacency that I see that concerns me actually than the pushback or the open advocacy. And so I'm kind of curious what your understanding of it all is.
Well, look, I think it's cliche, but the notion of this is how you got Trump, there's that kind of famous retort, definitely showed that millions of Americans were particularly fed up with political correctness and now kind of the successors to political correctness, people having to walk on eggshells to speak about basic truths that we all observe in our lives. Who wants to live? I guess some people do, but who wants to live in a society where you're afraid to speak about anything of consequence if you don't take the right position? Now, that said, those who do take the other side of this, while I don't think they're numbering in the tens of millions, the true believers or the cynics who exploit the true believers are incredibly powerful, influential, and loud. And so their influence, their power, their leverage over society, I think, is hugely outsized. And that gets to the schools, popular culture, much of the government itself, and certainly pretty much the entirety of the administrative state. So that's millions of people collectively. And then on top of that, the corporations. So you put all of these together, that's real power and influence. I do think my perception is that, first of all, as people get more removed from kind of suspended adolescence or, from school and even their young days, and I'm in my mid-30s to date myself. So as you have to operate in a real world and you have to support not just yourself, but maybe your spouse, or work with your spouse to support a family and beyond, and you actually have to live out in the real world, I think that obviously changes your perception. Another cliche, people always talk about, as you get older, you get more conservative. If you're, I forget what the exact saying goes, but if you're, young and you're not a liberal, you have no heart. If you're old and a liberal, you have no brain, that sort of thing. So look, that exists. I think certainly that as you have to grapple with real world problems and you're further away from being taken care of by someone else or living in the sphere of the academy, your worldview and your perspective changes. But I also think everyone, or a lot of people who are not in the true believer percentage of the public, does have a breaking point probably with constantly being fed a certain narrative, and that you must accept and that you must increasingly overtly publicly show. There's a recent example of this. There's a National Hockey League, one player on a team who did not want to wear, I think,
Right, I
like
saw
a
that.
rainbow colored jersey.
Right,
But that was a huge story that one person came
right.
out, and he was completely under fire, including by the National Hockey League, and probably
Hmm.
many activists as well. The fact that there was that huge public backlash, not as many people coming out for him on the other side, or at least people with
Yeah,
as loud a speaker, I think tells you, the challenge of, to your point, there's complacency. I'm sure there are millions of people who say, well, look, I don't really necessarily agree with this, but it's pretty much harmless if people want to espouse their progressive political views, and I don't want to offend anyone. It's not worth
right.
getting into a fight over it. I think there's probably a breaking point for each individual
Mm.
in terms of how far am I willing to acquiesce to a worldview that I disagree with. But again, they will have those concerns about, first of all, I don't want to offend someone. Second of all, I don't want to alienate my boss or go against my institution, an institution which my paycheck and therefore my livelihood and my family's future prospects relies upon. There's real power that
Yeah.
has in terms of getting people to conform to a worldview. So until that's broken, or until there's a change in the American public mind, I
Mm.
still think you're going to have a movement that looks a lot bigger and more powerful than it might be in terms of actual followers. But it's very hard to stand up against what looks like this indomitable, inexorable
Yeah.
tide, and particularly one that could impact, not just your earnings, but your livelihood, your dignity, and the prospects of your family.
Yeah, and I think the biggest concern is you mentioned it, it's just it for a lot of those who do want to speak up, appearances show that they actually don't, there might not be a lot of folks who that can kind of back them up, right? Like there's not a lot of coverage for those who, for example, would have been supportive of that hockey player in his decision because he specified that it was his religious belief. Even though there are probably millions of people in this country who would have supported his decision, but they probably don't speak up because they don't see that camaraderie amongst those who are kind of in that same camp. They don't even know that there are other people who think that out there. And that's kind of, honestly, I don't know, we can talk about whether it's intentional or not, or if we just kind of let a lot of the institutions go, but that's the downside of having no real control over the narratives from the conservative perspective. And so this is something that, again, on campuses, there are some student organizations that exist on these campuses where students can kind of find an opportunity to talk about conservative values or host debates and argue about the real issues with one another. Even those on the left find that those are interesting. But they're, at the same time, it's still a small percentage of students who are willing to be identified as conservatives because they've told me time and time again, it paints a target on their back, whether it be from faculty members or other students who will, find them on social media and find ways to dox them and lambast them and destroy their reputations. And so again, it is, you kind of wonder, like, I don't want to end on a sad note, obviously, here, or like a depressing note, but where do we gain that control back? And you said each individual has their breaking point. I think we saw a bunch of breaking points during the parents, movement with defending their kids' rights on campuses on K through 12 with regards to vaccinations and learning about, various sexual orientations and all of that stuff. So I think we are seeing some pushback that, and we should take note of this as us in the conservative movement, that there is something about, going after someone's kids, obviously, that is a huge breaking point across the board for a lot of individuals. But there are probably other breaking points that we have yet to discover, because I find it so disconcerting when you say that, yeah, you give up this, you give up that. And I think, like, historically, if you think about, like, the Jewish people, when the Nazis were coming to rise in Germany or other parts of Europe, they gave up, they kind of went along with various little concessions, little by little, until all of a sudden they were being shipped off to camps. And, they said, okay, we'll wear the star. We'll just, like, we don't want to make any trouble. We're going to wear this yellow star to self-identify, And I hate to constantly bring the Nazi comparison to all of these things, but it's just amazing how a society can, they make these little concessions over and over and over again, and you don't see how you don't have that foresight to kind of see how this is going to play out against you and against your family until it's too late. And I guess that's the biggest concern that I have here with, like, okay, we'll make some concessions with the language. We'll let them alter some of the meaning of words and the meaning of sexuality and gender and all these things. And then we'll just kind of go along with that. And to what end, right? Like to what, obviously there's an end goal here and no one's really asking themselves to what end.
Yeah, and in my view, the end is total control and power and influence through the state or through auxiliaries of the state that increasingly look like they're instruments of it, and they all have the same overarching ideology. And there are a lot of ways when you look at how do you combat this. You can look at how do you take back the institutions, or how do you influence these institutions using either political power or power of donors or beyond. But I do think individuals who courageously speak out, usually they can stir and inspire others to have the confidence to do the same. And so one of the things I continue to go back to in my own thinking on this is, and of course the challenge here is to speak out, you run massive risks, but the more people there are who are willing to speak out and on a principled basis, and to make the case for why, if you give up all these little things, ultimately you give up everything, or what won't you give up? Individuals can inspire and lead to substantial changes, even when odds are substantially stacked against. And let's note, this is the optimistic note I generally go back to in an otherwise kind of black pill conversation is, look, the progressives who took over all of these institutions, and starting with the schools, of course, were a fringe minority of a minority, many of them immigrants, marginal in American life in the early 20th century. They had a worldview, they had a strategy and goals and tactics, and they were able to ultimately take over every institution. That, from their vantage point in the early 1900s, or if you're looking at the Frankfurt School in the 30s and 40s and 50s and the like, anyone would have looked at that objectively and thought, how are these wacko academics going to take over all of American society? But their views ultimately really succeeded here in a country that would have otherwise looked hostile and askance at their worldview. So to that end, that means it's not impossible, but it's hard to imagine conservatives having their own march through the institutions that would look like the progressive one. And so then the question is, how do you combat when you're now 100 years behind? What do you do to catch up in that competition? What are the strategies and tactics you would use given all of the massive uphill battles that we face? And that's a question to the conservative movement today.
Yeah, I think you're right. That is an interesting underdog story from that perspective. Have not taken it into account, but it actually, I mean, we'll end on that note. It's not the happiest of notes, but it certainly is, like you said, not down this like dark path. So at least we can like find some inspiration from that fact. But Ben, thank you so much for joining Well Said today. I mean, it was great having you on. I think we touched on a lot of various issues that, like I said before, could easily be their own episodes. So I look forward to having you back on to dive deeper into some of these issues in the future. But, in the meantime, thank you everyone for joining us on the show. I'm Cherise Trump, and Ben, that was Well Said.